Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about the operational use of artillery at Waterloo. The French Year 11 system, which is what the guns and so forth were used at Waterloo and so forth, was the Year 11 system. It wasn't the Grievous system, and there were three different calibers that were used: the 12-pounder, the 6-pounder, and the 24-pounder howitzer. The M1808 system was basically using these gun tubes and so forth on cobbled together gun carriages. These were basically because the French were bankrupt yet again in 1808 and certainly didn't have any resources after they lost all their artillery pieces and so forth in Russia. Also, no Grievous system was used, guns were used, except in Spain from 1809. But the reason why they were used in Spain was because there were plenty of Spanish Grievous guns and ammunition. The M1808 system was using the woodwork from the Year 11 system and the wheels, axle, and metalwork and so forth from the Grievous guns, and they were salvaged. Also used the Grievous system, the Year 11 system, and the French system was the Netherlands and Brunswickers in 1815. These were of the foot and horse artillery, both had six-pounders and 2 howitzers. There were no Allied 12-pounders on the battlefield because these were in the reserve corps that were stationed in Hull. The British 6-pounder block trail, as you can see there, was a far more superior system and so forth than the parallel cheeks of all other artillery pieces and so forth, including the French. The carriages were lighter. And the most important thing is they had a 5-foot wheel for the carriage, for the gun carriage, the limber, ammunition wagon. And the other important part was ammunition supply. These were on ammunition boxes rather than individually having to actually transport the ammunition. Ammunition supply. These, the British system and so forth was used by the KGL, King's German Legion, and the Hanoverians. The ammunition boxes were on universal limber and caisson. There was swift resupply because all you had to do was just transport and transfer the boxes and so forth rather than individually. And also the caisson, or the ammunition car and so forth, could go anywhere the gun could go because it had 5-foot wheels. The problem with the French, Netherlands, Prussians, Brunswickers, etc., with the ammunition was in individual sales and had to be manhandled. Caissons were liable to turn over. They were more like articulated lorries, very high-sided and so forth. And the limber had a very small wheel, and the caisson also had a very small front wheel. So these had a tendency of bogging down. They were only about 3 foot. So the clearance in the mud and so forth was barely 1.5 feet. Allocation of Allied artillery. Up to 17th of June 1815, 2 field batteries to each infantry division was allocated, 1 horse battery to each cavalry brigade. Royal Horse Artillery was re-equipped by 9-pounders. This had nothing to do with Wellington. This was a decision made by Fraser and Wood of the Royal Artillery and the Board of Ordnance. The idea was to produce mobile artillery rather than horse artillery. This was to be able to actually get the 9-pounders to wherever they wanted to and so forth, so they could actually do a reasonable job and so forth against the feared French 12-pounder. On 18th of June 1815, these artillery reserve 9-pounders and Bull's howitzers were formed under Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Royal Horse Artillery. So these were a central reserve and so forth, which could actually be then sent to wherever they were required. This only left the Royal Horse Artillery with the 6-pounders, batteries and so forth, and they were left onto the left wing of the army. This is always a vexed question for me. Was there a Grand Battery? Well, if you actually go down here, did the battery coordinate upon a part of a line for breakthrough? Well, no, it didn't. Did it limit the lateral movement of the enemy? Well, no, because Wellington had cleverly used the reverse slope, and there was a road running behind the actual crest line. Did the batteries progressively advance as at Friedland? Well, they fired at long range, and did even get into effective range, let alone canister range, for the Dillon attack. How long did they fire? Barely half hour. This was probably limited in the most by the lack of ammunition, being that Napoleon had forgotten to actually ask for more ammunition to be supplied until the morning of the battle. And of course, you're talking about getting the message to Paris and then the ammunition supplied. So that would probably take at least 2 weeks. And also, the Prussians were already within an hour of the battlefield. So it wasn't like Friedland. It wasn't a Grand Battery in those terms and so forth. And it wasn't Hougoumont blasting a hole in the Russians. This is Beck's map of Waterloo. Major Beck is a very interesting character in that he was the official cartographer for the Great War. So he had a brilliant eye for the terrain and so forth. And also, being that he was writing back in before the First World War, he actually understood something about horses and logistics and so forth, which again, sort of going is something that we are lost nowadays because we've got the car, the lorry, and the airplane. For me, this is one of the greatest sort of achievements and so forth in the battle. For Wellington was the battlefield management. Also, we must actually sort of remember that Wellington's orders were based upon Greenwich Mean Time and weren't actually local time. This again sort of going is an area that sort of has eluded many historians. And also the importance of the effective read receipt system. This was simply that the orders were sent out in an envelope. They were read by the recipient, who would write on where he was and the time he received it on the envelope, and that was then returned to Wellington's HQ. So he actually knew where his brigades and divisions and so forth were when they received the order, and he could actually work out, well, what could they actually do in the time and so forth. The other part was Wellington was able to predict all the French movements. He actually sent orders half hour to an hour before the French attacks. He always had fresh troops in hand. And all of these movements were, of course, covered by the artillery, and especially that reserve artillery and so forth that was under Fraser, the Royal Horse Artillery. This is 9 o'clock on the 18th of June, 1815. And you can see in the top right-hand corner, the artillery reserve was at Mont Saint-Jean, which is here. This is 9 to 1300 on 18th of June. 2 batteries of Clinton's division were with Adams' brigade. These would then be taken away and moved forward before Adams' brigade were actually deployed, or Clinton's division. This is the third Alton's third division. 2 9-pounder foot batteries of the division were over the road in front of the wood. Now, again, sort of going, we need to actually sort of remember that the orientation is actually north is at the bottom and south is at the top. The gun movements. Now, this is an important thing to sort of remember in sort of going that, and it's always a problem. We're trying to actually sort of draw maps or actually understand where the various artillery units were, because they kept on moving. Weber-Smith's Royal Horse Artillery was ordered to the right centre. Simper's KGL Horse Artillery Troop moved to the second line. Bull's Royal Horse Artillery returned to a position overlooking the orchard at Hougoumont. We'll be talking about Bull's troop a bit later. At 1600 was the first cavalry attack. Something that's always missed is that the frontage of this cavalry attack was barely 1,000 yards. Now, when you think about that, you could actually deploy just one brigade to cover 1,000 yards. It's always amazing the number of troops and so forth that were actually packed by by Wellington and so forth into this area. Few, if any, Allied infantry were protecting the ground from the ridge to Hougoumont. French cavalry were repulsed initially by British and KGL cavalry. Gun line was constantly being reinforced. This is actually looking just across the battlefield from a position of La Haye Sainte farm. And you can see the undulating nature and so forth. And then at the top right-hand corner, you've got Hougoumont. Now, all these folds and so forth have actually been smoothed out by modern ploughing. Covering Clinton's advance. The second division moved from the reserve at the farm of Mont Saint-Jean farm and to cover the advance. This was Mercer's Royal Horse Artillery, which again, sort of going, everybody's heard of Mercer, and Sinclair's Royal Artillery. Both of them were armed with 9-pounders. At 1630, the interval between the cavalry attacks. This gave time for Wellington to readjust his line and so forth. The French attack against the French infantry were actually threatening, again, the Hougoumont orchard. French skirmishers were menacing the British and KGL gun line, which was basically where we've got the red there noticing and so forth. The French horse artillery were firing on Hougoumont with shell and 6-pounder shot. And again, sort of going, we'll be talking about who actually set alight at Hougoumont a bit later. At 1645, Clinton's division advanced to secure Hougoumont to actually stop the French infantry from outflanking the orchard and taking the guards and the other defenders and so forth in the orchard in the flank. Duplat's KGL brigade was deployed behind Hougoumont. Adam's brigade actually chased off the French that were trying to enter the orchard. The 2nd 95th, 71st, 3rd 95th advanced in the 4-deep line. The 52nd were actually in the support behind. And as noted at the bottom, the 71st got far too far and possibly got almost to about here, which is sort of well in advance of the orchard. But again, sort of going, all of this stopped the French from menacing the Allied line and allowed Wellington to reform his line. This is a sketch of the KGL and British gun line. It's important to remember this watershed. Basically you can't actually see, if you're one side of the watershed, you can't see the other side of the watershed. But again, this is where you probably have later sort of talking about sort of going that the guards couldn't actually see what was happening later on with Chassé defeating the other part of the Imperial Guard coming up the hill. Over that watershed and so forth, the Adams Light Brigades and so forth were deployed. In front of Maitland's first guards was Bolton Royal Artillery. And that's one of the famous drawings of it. Adams' brigade acted, as can be seen there, as a breakwater, because it also funneled the French cavalry attacks. So again, instead of being able to actually hit 1,000 yards of the frontage, barely 500 yards could be attacked, and also they would be flanked by the troops in La Haye-Saint. The breakwater, Maitland's was 400 to 500 yards to the left of the Brunswickers to the right. Again, sort of going, remember, if you look at the earlier maps and so forth, Maitland's guards and so forth were deployed almost behind the Hougoumont wood. So what happened was that progressively they were moved to the right as more troops were moved to the left as more troops were put to the right. Again, this is a problem as ever with most British maps, is that they have a tendency of missing off all the allies, KGL, Brunswickers and Hanoverians in this case. So it actually becomes very difficult to actually realise that the space between Maitland and Grant Domburg and so forth were filled up by the Brunswickers, but they're actually missing from this map. This is actually quite interesting, looking at just the sheer amount of gun batteries that are there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 12 guns. Each gun's had 6 pieces in each battery. So that's a huge number of guns that were deployed there. The lines that are on there are giving cross sections, which you'll see in the next slide. And again, you can actually see the different forms and the different types of slope. The slope nearest to Hougoumont and so forth was actually very steep, whereas they become sort of shallower, and so where you get nearer to the watershed, and then it becomes steep again, and so where you get towards the La Haye-Saint. Right, this is how a gun works. Well, really, you've got to actually think about it as basically a compressed air gun. That's really how it works. You've got a wad in the front. The wad was only used in naval service, so you can forget about that part of it. The ball would be sitting on a piece of wood and so forth. And the idea was that when the gunpowder burnt, it would actually give a huge amount of pressure. It creates about 1,000 atmospheres of pressure before the ball actually moves down the bore. Now, gunpowder is not a substance. It's not one thing. It's actually an aggregate. And that's something you've got to actually sort of remember about sort of going that how good a gunpowder is not about its ingredients as such. It's how it was actually put together. Gunpowder was produced by private companies before the Border Ordnance involvement. Border Ordnance involvement was very important because of the supply of gunpowder and the quality of gunpowder that was produced. Again, sort of going the Royal Powder Mill and so forth, which is very close to where I live in Faversham. the Royal Gunpowder Factory in Waltham Abbey, and again, sort of going, that's hopefully will be again open to the public and so forth, and is an important place to go. And then there's the Irish Ballycollig Royal Gunpowder Mills. Gunpowder is an aggregate. It's basically got 75% saltpeter, potassium nitrate, 10% sulfur, and that's all it's there is to actually lower the ignition temperature, and the 15% charcoal softwood. The softwood charcoal was there as a sponge, which all the other ingredients and so forth were actually in effect stuck to. We've always talked about, and you may have heard about British cylinder powder being being much better. Well, actually, it was considerably better. It was at least 25% more powerful. It was where you put the charcoal, the softwood, in a cylinder, and you boiled away, and you removed all the moisture and the rosins and so forth. The saltpeter came from India. Now, the power of the British cylinder powder was a real problem in the revolutionary period for the Royal Navy, because it basically blew up most of their artillery pieces. And it was rather embarrassing that they had to go and find old artillery pieces and so forth that didn't have a high sulfur content, because the sulfur content made cast iron barrels brittle. Now, this is always an interesting sort of conversation of sort of going, who set Hougoumont on fire? Hougoumont was a high status building with slate roofs. French long guns could not penetrate the walls because the walls were actually built as you would build a castle, in that you had a wall and then rubble and then another wall, but also how thick they were. They could be at least a foot to a foot and a half thick. This actually sort of shows you sort of going why the 12-pounder couldn't actually penetrate the Hougoumont walls. I would consider Hougoumont to be good masonry. And again, sort of like going, you can see sort of going, you would have to get considerably close to it to even have an attempt to actually penetrating. Now, none of the guns that were used against Hougoumont were 12-pounders. So actually you were using 6-pounders, which had less than half the penetration. This is a drawing of howitzer by Charles Dupin. This is a French spy who came to Britain just after the Napoleonic Wars and drew all the various maps, all the various plans and so forth of the artillery system of the British and so forth from memory. And these are probably about the only contemporary drawings of British ordnance and so forth that we do actually exist. Most of the drawings that people are using and so forth are mid-Victorian. A howitzer is not a long gun. It does not fire by direct fire, as in angle of fire. It is doing about plunging fire. It fires a shell which is hollow, cast iron, and is filled with gunpowder. Or it can fire canister filled with musket balls at short range, barely sort of 200 yards. The third one, which was rarely used but very effective, was against buildings. And this was carcass, which we'll go on to a bit later. As I said before, these are the only contemporary plans of British artillery, and they happen to be drawn by Frenchmen, which is always a little difficult to sort of like deal with, in that unfortunately the Firepower Museum will never open again, and the likelihood of having a Royal Artillery Museum is very unlikely, because the cost of it has been transferred to the Royal Artillery. And I think the Royal Artillery would rather have useful things like body armor and various other things like that to actually have, rather than old relics in a museum. This is a plan of the 5.5-inch howitzer. You can see sort of going that it's actually built up, but also the other important thing is that you've got the elevating screw, which is here, and that could only be depressed, so you could only get at best about 15-degree elevation. Also, you didn't want any more elevation than that because the forces and so forth would break the actual trail at the back, which again sort of going occurred on a number of occasions in the peninsula. Much has been made by authors and so forth about this single French howitzer and so forth that was put into the Hougoumont orchard. And we'll go on and talk about this. This is actually an example of the Ferrar's map of 1777. Both sides were actually using copies of this map. There was no available modern maps. So it's again sort of going whether Napoleon actually knew about Hougoumont. Well, it was on his map. So I can't see any reason why people would actually say sort of going he had nothing, he didn't know anything about Hougoumont. And also a number of his generals had actually fought over the battlefield and so forth, and even been in defense of Hougoumont. The single French howitzer, this is just south of the Hougoumont orchard. There are too many things against this. It did not have enough elevation. The distance was borderline the minimum range of a shell. It again sort of going, it takes time for it to be armed and so for it to actually explode. And again sort of going, this is still line of sight firing. So you've got to actually be able to see the target and adjust to actually be able to hit it. There was too much blue on blue danger and so forth. If you missed Hougoumont, you'll hit the French that were attacking on the other side of Hougoumont. And also the other problem is sort of going, it takes you about 5 minutes to lay and organize and so forth to actually fire a carcass with a howitzer. And yet there's within 100, 200 yards, Allied muskets and probably riflemen. Also, there's limited ammunition. There's no way that a caisson could be brought up. All ammunition had to be manhandled up in satchels. Again, sort of going, I would consider this howitzer just used as close support to fire canister and so forth against the orchard. And we've got a number of accounts and so forth that suggest this. Carcass. This was fired by howitzers and mortars. It's basically going, it's a ball filled with stuff that won't actually, which will be still alight for about a minute, 2 minutes, and so forth. So it's filled with saltpeter, sulfur, antimony, rosin, and pitch. And also it's got 3 fuses rather than 1 fuse. So again, sort of like going, the idea is that it will be alight, very hot, and it will be able to set things alight. French horse artillery to the west of Hougoumont. They're on the same elevation, clear line of sight, able to see the fall of shot, no chance of blue on blue, no obstructions or trees in the way, shot and shell damaged in the painting for the western side. In paintings for the western side, I mean, again, sort of going, that was very useful seeing these from Gareth's collection, Gareth Glover's collection. So the cons against sort of like them being able to hit and possibly set alight Hougoumont, I can't see really anything on there. The only thing I have got that's a little difficult is to actually know whether the French were actually using carcass at the time. And I haven't got anything sort of conclusive to actually suggest that. Ball's troop, Royal Horse Artillery. This was actually moved down to give fire support to Hougoumont. And the idea was that it was ordered to fire indirectly over Hougoumont into Hougoumont Wood. this is considered to be the first indirect use of indirect fire in open battle. Indirect fire had been used at various stages and so forth for over 100 years against fortifications. In this case, Ramsay acted as a spotter to recall fall of shot. They were firing at long to extreme range. So the error in the range and so forth was plus or minus 100 yards, let alone having high obstacles in the way, like the chateau itself. The other thing is that people forget is you had a 24-second flight time. That's how long it took before it actually hit the ground. So you could say, sort of going in windy conditions, it was like trying to judge catching a skier in a cricket ball in windy conditions. They were firing a mixture of shell and shrapnel. It's at the time was called spherical case. And this was only used by the British from about 1801. Interestingly, the trials for spherical case was actually done at Shorncliffe in the batteries and so forth at the foot of the hill at Shorncliffe in Kent. The fusing with wooden fuses was so critical. The shells were filled with musket balls and a bursting charge. They had a tendency of causing premature detonation and so forth because of friction and so forth, causing the gunpowder to actually explode. So, was it Ball's troop? Well, they were firing blind, indirect fire. There was a high risk of blue and blue. They were at extreme range, so the error was plus or minus 100 yards, as I said before. But they were at a higher elevation. So again, sort of going, they could cause plunging fire and cause damage to the roofs. The cons, the gunners were amongst the most experienced in the Royal Artillery. Higher elevation, so hoped to clear Hougoumont. They caused a great toll on the French in Hougoumont Wood, but that still doesn't mean that it may not have been one or two of the shells and so forth from the Royal Horse Artillery that may have hit them. So probably the most damage and so forth was caused by the French Horse Artillery howitzers from the west, and Ball's Royal Horse Artillery troop may have actually caused some damage. Again, sort of going, I will be working with Penelope Burton that has found records of this in the troop library and so forth, and hopefully we'll be able to actually publish that soon. This came from a question that was actually asked of me. There was a French 24-pounder shell that was found at Mont Saint-Jean by Waterloo uncovered. Howitzer shell, as I've said before, is not filled by high explosive. It's filled by gunpowder that needs to be dry to actually burn, deflagrate. Also, potassium nitrate is extremely soluble, as all gardeners and so forth will testify, that they use potassium nitrate and so forth as a fertilizer. So could easily have been cleaned out with water. So I can't really see why the shell was destroyed. There's no scientific reason for it being destroyed, but probably it was the regulations. But questions should really be asked to Waterloo Uncovered. Now we come to the position of the shell. Now this was at Mont Saint-Jean, position of the artillery reserve. The size, weight, and caliber was not actually stated, but it was assumed that it was a 24-pounder shell. We don't know from what was written whether there was remnants of wooden fuses, let alone whether the actual shell was filled. So you could say it's wishful thinking that it's actually French. It is most likely to be Brunswick, Netherlands, or more likely even Prussian. It could have been actually French, but that was because that's where the French captured artillery and so forth was deposited after the battle. I've written about 70 books that are still in print and so forth, most of which are in print with Ken Troutman on various subjects. And also I've done a whole series of books and so forth with the Shorncliffe Trust. One of them, which again sort of going, I quoted, and some of the maps were from today, was from Adams Light Brigade in the Netherlands and at Waterloo, where we tried to actually work out where were the Adams Brigade was at Waterloo, and my dear co-author Susan Law actually looked at where her husband's ancestor and so forth actually stood and was injured and so forth. So that was quite an interesting sort of thing. Right. Unfortunately, this isn't the usual presentation where it would be any questions. And again, the other thing to remember about the Royal Artillery and the artillery, it's UPK everywhere. This is why you find that very rarely do you find on maps any information on where actually the artillery were actually deployed. Thank you very much.